Could I just interrupt you a second? Did you put us on record like they asked you to?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Oh, no, the recording started.
Oh, it did start. Okay, I'm sorry.
Bernadette did it for me.
Oh,
you,
great. Hi, Bernadette.
Yeah, we so appreciate what Bernadette and Emily are both professional staff for the Labor and Employment Relations Association, and they've mastered the infrastructure for a virtual conference. So thank you. Well, I'm delighted to welcome everybody to a unique presentation. We'll have a series of short 5-minute briefings, and then there'll be time for dialogue and discussion. We have a couple of folks actually on the panel who can't be here, which I'll substitute for them. But the whole spirit of this is around a kind of work that is not new, but that is taking on greater importance, what we're calling data work. And the institutions that surround that work, multi-stakeholder consortia. You hear a lot these days about data analytics, and there is not a university that isn't starting a data science program of one kind or another. Sports and data analytics is, of course, transformational in various ways. This is not that panel. There's another part of data work, data curation, research data that you're going to be hearing about. And just to telegraph a dimension of this, in some curious ways and some highly consequential ways, the data analytics work tends to be more male-dominated. The data curation is seen as women's work, not entirely, but in important ways. And so in a sense, we're lifting up an aspect of work with data that is less well-known, less visible, but no less important, and in some ways worthy of much greater attention. Basically, I will begin with some general introductory remarks. Matt Mayernick will dive in on what do we exactly mean by data work. Helen will take us into an example of a consortium centered on data work that started over 50 years ago. Actually, it just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Ron will describe a more recent consortia that has emerged that is also illustrative. Nick will then kind of be the hinge as we look at the people doing the data work and what happens to them in their lives and careers as they leave universities, both as students, faculty, and staff. Mike Maffie, as I said, for those of you that just joined us, actually had to step out of the house with an escaped cat. So in this business, we talk about herding cats, and he's now trying to do that real life. But I will at least, I'm sure inadequately, cover some of the material that he's planned. And Barbara Mittleman is traveling and doesn't have good web connectivity, so I'll cover some of what she was going to present. And then Alysia Garmulewicz will be wrapping things up with the frontiers of new institutional arrangements around digital fabrication and data. And then John King will be serving as our discussant. So these will be short presentations designed to give you time for discussion. If you have questions, though, during the presentations, don't hesitate to hit chat or to unmute. Because I'm sharing the slides, I can't see somebody when you do that, but others will let me know if there's a comment or a question. But our focus is on research, data sharing, and reuse. Simply put, the sharing of data has long been valued as needed for reproducible science, but increasingly it's seen as a way of expanding applications, of broadening participation, of generating impacts, of transforming fields and disciplines, and addressing societal challenges. And you'll hear about all of those uses of data in today's presentation. What you'll also hear about is a subtext, that there are barriers. People view data as proprietary. Incentives in universities and in industry and in government are often not supporting collaboration. It's technically challenging and difficult. There's cost and time involved. Of course, not all data can and should be shared, but starting in 2013, and there's a longer history that you'll hear about, the US government, the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy basically said any federally funded research should, not just the publications, but the underlying data should become publicly available. And of course, the goal was not just reproducible science, but economic innovation. People in Congress looked at the Weather Channel using actually the kind of data that Matt deals with and said there's economic value in those data. We've been studying multi-stakeholder consortia centered on open sharing of data in science. And as this chart shows you, between 1950 and 2000, to the best of our ability, we've been able to account just under 24 multi-stakeholder consortia on this topic. But in the years since, in just 20 years, we've had a five-fold increase in literally half the time. So in a sense, a 10-fold increase in the number and formation of these kinds of consortia. So today, if you are a researcher like this woman on our right, there is an entire ecosystem, some of which you'll be hearing about, of consortia of various kinds that have come together to do together what they can't do separately. And just to finally further motivate the conversation, I'll share with you one final story. Years ago, and a couple people here were in the room at the time, a group of data facilities had come together under the National Science Foundation's Earth Cube initiative, which was designed to advance geosciences through the sharing of data. And it was a 3-day workshop with the first day on data sharing tools and methods. And the second day, as a co-facilitator, I was assuming we were going to do a charter to launch a new consortium, a Council of Data Facilities. So I asked the group, are we ready to work on the charter? And the room erupted, but not in a good way. My co-facilitator had a way of checking the group. She said, well, hold up 5 fingers if you want to do a consortium charter, 4 if you want to, but with some reservations, down to a fist if you're opposed. Well, a third of the room held up 5 fingers and 2/3 held up a fist. And we obviously had to stop and figure out what was going on. It turns out those that were coming from the National Science Foundation wanted to have voice on these issues, wanted to form an organization, and were all gung-ho to go forward. Those who had funding from other agencies didn't want one more committee, one more meetings, one more institutional arrangement on their calendars. They were mostly in the room to make sure nothing happened that would disrupt their funding, they clearly said. So we split the group into 1/3 to work on a draft charter if there was to be a council, and 2/3 to work on other issues, metadata and other things. What was interesting is the group that didn't want to form something new, every half an hour or so, they said, well, I guess if we had a council, it could do this or that. The other group said, we better come up with a lightweight charter because these people don't want bureaucracy. And when they came together on day 3 by consensus and with acclamation, they formed the Council of Data Facilities. And I share the story both to get you into the mindset of thinking about data and data facilities, but also to suggest that this is a human-constructed, non-deterministic view of data and technology. In a sense, we'll be telling the story of people working with data and constructing arrangements around them, institutional arrangements that are new, emerging, and important. But first, let's go to Matt and talk about the very idea of data work.
Thanks, Joel. So I'm just going to get a couple ideas on the table, I think, to punctuate some of the things Joel said, and to think about what does it mean when we talk about data work, and what kinds of things might that encompass. And so I, in some sense, am a data worker myself at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where I have both research and kind of operational roles in building, studying, and implementing data management and curation systems. And so when I've started these conversations with Joel and the rest of the colleagues talking about data work, I think one thing that's really clear to me is, and as Joel said, getting into the data facility space in the geosciences, where I've now been for 10 years, there's a long history of data work in this field, and I would argue in many fields, both professional fields and academic fields. And so my tagline out here at the very top, data work is not a new type of work, it's not necessarily a single type of work. And so I've roughly broken it out here in these two bullets in the second part of the slide around data science and data curation, as Joel touched on earlier on. And typically when we hear data work, as Joel said, data science is kind of the term that most folks think about in kind of the cultural sense right now, where it's the statistics, the analytics, the visualizations, and so on. But again, even that type of work, you can date back decades to centuries. So both of the images on the right are from the 1960s from NCAR, which was when NCAR was founded. And NCAR was founded to be in part supporting data work, computing, and things like that for the university community within atmospheric sciences. So if you go to the next slide, please, Joel. Just again, a couple of ideas to kind of get on the table here. So despite what I just said, it's very clear that there's increase in interest and discussion about data work, and of course, new job titles. The data science job sector is exploding, and so on. So it's not necessarily new, but it's exploding. So why is that the case? Why is it newly being recognized and named as a specific kind of work, and in different institutional contexts, as Joel was talking about? So again, just to get some ideas on the table. Certainly there's technical sort of dependencies here, right? The internet has enabled exchange of data in ways that certainly weren't possible before. Increased adoption of common data interchange formats, and pick your favorite acronym for that, but there's many different types of data interchange formats that really enable distribution of data on the web. And then there's open source software developments that have been built to take advantage of these general purpose formats. So all of these have made just kind of from a technical point of view, exchange of data very easy online. But that's it'd be too technologically dependent to just talk about that. So of course, there's lots of other reasons why data work is really becoming prominent, and the COVID situation, I think, has even accelerated this. But there's high profile things like ClimateGate that raise profile of data as a political object, right? Sort of the political value of data in whatever your political orientation might be. The economic value of data, I think, is without, there's no doubt about that at this point. And some of the web stuff, the social media companies that have made huge profits based on data analytics demonstrate that. But I also want to put on the table, the idea that if you kind of combine this sort of technical advance along with the increase in profile in data, this idea that data became viewed as something that could be controlled and exploited, rather than just something that could be cared for. And from a profession point of view, I think we all recognize that anything that's care related has been devalued in our society systematically. And anything that is sort of more male associated in whatever way that might be is elevated and sort of more valued economically and politically. And as Joel touched on, I go to meetings for data science and data curation, and it's very dramatic differences in gender ratios. And as I said before, the data science one is the one has grasped the public attention. So I think there's a lot of reasons why we might talk about data work. All of these are intertwined. There's no one that sort of sticks up above the other. But I think all of these could be of interest for further discussion. So I'll stop there, Joel.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for getting us started and really putting those themes on the table. Helen, take us through an early consortium around data.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about the Protein Data Bank, which is a repository for the three-dimensional structures of biological molecules, proteins and nucleic acids. There are more than 175,000 structures in the PDB. There's a lot of usage, 2.4 million data downloads a day, and it's used by researchers in many fields. Next slide. It was established in 1971, built on the first structures that were determined of proteins that gave their discoverers Nobel Prizes. There was a lot of community activism to set up the archive, and in 1971, the PDB was started as a result of all of this community interest and activism. Next slide. From the beginning, the policies for the PDB were always set by the community. There were actually, because of the AIDS epidemic in particular, there was some concern that the data absolutely had to be public and out there. And so procedures were set up for data deposition. There were meetings to work out the details of format. It's a global consortium. It always has been, but that was formalized in 2003. And then procedures for ensuring that the data were well curated according to best practices were set up in 2011. All of this done with heavy community input. Next slide.
And by the way, Helen, you should say that you were at the founding and in a sense were the founding architect of this.
Yes, I was. So I was part of the early community activism in the 60s, and that led to the setting up the PDB, and it's basically been my life's work since then. We also set up standards for validation, and we experts in each area that were represented by the PDB got together to come up with those standards. White papers were written exactly how those standards should be implemented, and then the PDB implemented those standards. Next slide. So what has the data sharing enabled? Well, just one of the most important things is that it prevented data from being lost, but it helped more structures to be determined because old structures could be used to generate new structures. It allowed us to make new validation methods. It was the foundation of an entirely new field that never existed before, called structural bioinformatics. These data are essential for drug discovery, and pretty much every drug that is put on the market has had to use the data in the PDB in order to define the targets and how they were going to be used. It's allowed a field called protein design to make new kinds of proteins. And most recently, the area of protein structure prediction, which got a big splash in the press in the New York Times, where just by the chemical structure alone, you could, the group called DeepMind, which is part of the Alphabet group, were able to predict structures effectively. And this has huge implications for biology and drug development going forward. Next slide. So because the PDB existed, it was ready when COVID came to our shores. And actually, the first structure that was determined, a COVID-related structure, was in January of 2020. And since then, there are 1,200 structures of COVID-related proteins in the PDB, and these structures are essential for understanding how the disease progresses, and also how to prevent it and have drugs against it. So now fully 11% of the PDB is COVID related. In order to make that all happen, the biocuration of these structures were prioritized, and the depositors were strongly encouraged to release the data prior to publication, which in the scientific community is a really big deal. So we were ready and very, very effective in helping with this terrible pandemic. So in closing, I'd like to mention something about the culture. One of the earliest people in the field and a mentor to key people in the field was J.D. Bernal, who was a crystallographer in Cambridge and was involved in the very, very first structure of diffraction pattern of a protein in 1935. But more important,
Gosh, I know we've, over a period of years, there occasionally have been.
Bonnie, you'll need to mute.
And stuff, but I'm
Bonnie?
not aware of a
You
formalized.
can mute her,
program.
Joel.
I can
Okay.
check in with,
All right, let me get up.
yeah. I'm sorry, I was on a conference, Bruce, so my mind is not quite with it. I can, no, that's okay. I can check in with Clint. And
Yeah.
if,
Bonnie,
and do you want me to
You can
do that
right
too,
click
or
on
do
the
you want-
dots.
Yeah, I got it. There, I did it.
you did it. Okay.
Sorry, it took so long.
So the important thing is that he wrote a book. He had very strong views about the social function of science and the importance of social responsibility. And that actually permeates the entire field. Everyone is aware of that, and it has changed the culture of the field. And I can compare it with other fields at a different time, but that's very important. And then Eleanor Ostrom, who did not know anything about what we do, it turns out that what we did as a community followed her ideas about the importance of devising very clear rules for how you manage information and how you build things. And so she gave very clear analyses of how this is done. And what she said is what we actually wound up doing inadvertently. We didn't know that. And so the structure that she is well known for is what we in fact followed. So that's what I need to say about this. We've had 50 very successful years, and I hope we have many more.
Thank you. And we really appreciate pulling back the curtain on the organizational or institutional side of the Protein Data Bank. We're going to do the same thing with the Quilt. Ron, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Joel. In thinking about this, I remember when I was in my early school days, physical libraries held the data resources that we needed to do the data work. And you either went there or you ordered a book or ordered copies or whatever. Today, libraries keep providing the excellent curation and the personnel to do the data work. But the internet has drastically changed that. As Matt said, the internet has motivated a lot more data work just by access to data, both from libraries, from huge instruments like the NOAA uses, and the NRAO, the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. This data wasn't available before, and today it is based on the internet. Well, I'm basically a vice president for IT at University of Virginia, and in my role, one of the things that I have to do is to make sure that data is available to researchers. And making that data available has been a focus of mine for over 20 years now. Many, many years ago, I was involved at Georgia Tech in the creation of a regional computer network called Suranet that connected universities up to high-performance computing centers. That then turned into regional networks that connected universities together and made them able to get data in many, many ways. What's been fascinating, though, is the fact that once you connect resources, they grow exponentially. The old joke used to be, what's the value of one fax machine? It's 0. But as you put 2 people on fax machine, they can talk together. And as it grows and grows, the ability for people to talk together is just amazing. Well, in the early days, these research networks connected solely to get to the resources on the ends. Then they became the regional networks, as I said, Suranet, for example, and NiserNet, as well as others. Many of the regions, the larger regions, had these networks. But something happened in about the early 90s, the late 80s to early 90s, which was the availability of fiber optic cable, which really catapulted these regional optical networks into existence in parallel with the phone companies, setting up some kind of, a lot of times, a political fight between people who are building these networks out. When the internet was created after NSFNet turned into net, and all of the networking that we had put a lot of time into became commercialized, then all of a sudden a vacuum was left in the universities. And Joe, you can go to the next slide. So these regional networks were on their own, and decided that it was time to start sharing at least best practices and different ideas. At conferences, many of us would get together in order to talk about what we were doing. You know, how did you find fiber? Who is your best contact for getting this equipment and so forth? And then as other people joined there, the meetings that we had, it was kind of like what Joel was saying earlier about the group gets together and decides, what are we going to do next? There was a lot of talking, and a lot of folks got together and voluntarily formulated these meetings that we held every time we went to conferences. These meetings took hold, and we found the value of meeting together in order to solve these same problems about getting access to data and information to our constituents at the universities grew. In 2001, as you can see on the right-hand side, the charter of the Quilt was formed in Washington, D.C. as an organization. The notion of the Quilt, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it's a bunch of loosely stitched together regional networks that are different. The Quilt is a very good model for that type of organization. We hired a full-time CEO that has been working with the Quilt for a long time and has done an amazing job at pulling resources together, convening meetings, working with the larger community, including the K-12 community, which has now been brought in. These regional networks that first served only the higher ed group now serve state networks that bring the K-12 schools in. And a good example of value here, when we first started talking about these networks in the late 90s, our internet service that we bought as a university cost $350 per month for a megabit of service. Today, we're paying less than $1 a month, sometimes 50 cents a megabit per second per month. And that only came about by building this buying group called the Quilt, who could go to the vendors and say, we have this much that we're buying, give us the best price that you can, and got the competition to drive the pricing down for us. So the value of the Quilt in providing access to our researchers to get to the data that they needed has been played out again and again, until now we have the FCC works with the Quilt as a neutral third party to find out technical answers to technical questions rather than going to any one of the particular proprietary groups that do this kind of stuff. So it's been an interesting 20 years, or actually probably 25 years. And I think this is crucial. The connectivity is crucial to seeing how data work is now forming into something new based on the huge amounts of data that are out there available at the touch of your fingers, but the lowered quality of that data based on the huge amounts and the lack of curation. So I'll stop there, Joe.
Super, thank you. And needless to say, although you didn't exactly say it, you were at the center of forming the Quilt, and you know, we really appreciate the front row seat on that. I don't believe Michael Maffie is here, so I'm going to just give you a quick overview of what his work is. Many of you in LIRA know his work, which is really extraordinary. This is data as a contested terrain, not just as a collaborative terrain. He began by studying the New York City Uber drivers, and he's now studied other ride-sharing drivers in other places and on other platforms. But essentially, what the drivers found is that they did not have transparency on whether they were getting the tips that the riders were putting, when fares were changing, such as a surge or what have you, who was getting what tips, and in particular, issues of harassment and discrimination that may have been happening on the platform. And yet when they tried to get the company data, they found that it was more and more opaque. And so what they did is they basically started to share notes and share their data and reverse engineered what the platform does. And they basically figured out the algorithms that were giving them the work or not. And that essentially they built up a data infrastructure in contrast to the opaque platform on which they were being employed, revealing, I think, a couple of important lessons. One, that the data itself is central to the work. Second, that the core issues of transparency for the customer, but now also for the employee, is a contested terrain. And importantly, through collective action, they were able to regain some power and control over their work. So needless to say, what we've started with is collaboration to enable data sharing. What Mike brings to the conversation is the fact that the views of data are not always everyone holding hands and singing Kumbaya. But nonetheless, I want to now turn to Nick to take us into a way of viewing what happens to the people who work with research data. The floor is yours, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So we did a study of NCSA, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois. And what we were studying is this class of worker, I guess, that you would call cyber infrastructure, that we sometimes call cyber infrastructure professionals or cyber infrastructure personnel. And these are kind of the folks in universities who not only do data work, but also, you know, around computing. So it's for NCSA, it's around supercomputing, but it's computing, software, infrastructure, and then data generation, data use, data curation. There's a whole bunch of roles, and they're kind of fit in to the university. It's a very insecure position. They're generally on soft money, meaning they're funded off of grants, and there's no real security over the long term. Oftentimes, these aren't official positions at the university. And there's also this apprenticeship model where oftentimes you find people wherever you can in a university and you train them up through an apprenticeship to be fairly skilled or sometimes incredibly highly skilled, and it upskills the entire workforce. So what happens is these organizations that have a lot of these cyber infrastructure personnel and a lot of data workers, once they skill them up, they may lose them to industry because they pay less. Industry, of course, pays more. And then there's this problem that these organizations have where they cannot retain such folks, or those folks that they do retain are very low paid and of course, insecure in what they find. So one of the things we're doing is we're working with NCSA and some other organizations, or we have in the past, where all right, how can we make the message around these cyber infrastructure folks, how can we make it strong? And one of the messages that we're trying to help them with, and this was the results of a pilot project we did with NCSA, to show how we're upskilling the workforce for their state. You know, you see the big arrow of all the people who went to California, but the biggest arrow actually is not here. It's the ones that stayed in Illinois. So it's one of these things that we're upskilling the workforce with these much needed skills for the state of Illinois. And then this, of course, shows where they went. And we refer to this as the diaspora. As they go through this apprenticeship and they get there, they go off into the world and off into industries and upskill those industries. So next slide, please. And you know, it can be different industries. So you see how many went off to academia. And then, of course, the variety of other from government and software industries. And then when we get into actual businesses, they were interested in that. At the time we did this, the majority of folks that went to businesses, Caterpillar was hiring them. And then, of course, a lot of tech firms. And you see this here. HDF was a consulting firm. But the nice thing that we see with this is that around this group of folks, these cyber infrastructure personnel, and I don't know if we want to quite call them consortia yet, but I would say consortial arrangements are being formed, and there are a number of them and a number of efforts and conferences, and where these folks are getting together and they're starting to, you know, try to tell this story about this workforce to the academy, to universities and research organizations, and they're trying to build bodies of knowledge, and you know, there are a number of things that they're doing that are, I would say are consortial. So
cool.
I'll turn it over to the.
Thank you, Nick. And as I said, Barbara was having connectivity issues, but I really appreciate, Nick, the way by looking at the workforce not as computing centers that are losing talent, but that are actually contributing to society, you've lifted up kind of a hidden feed into the other side, the data analytics that we hear about on the business side. the second to last briefing, this is from Barbara Mittleman. She was the architect for the Biomarkers Consortium. I've written 2 papers with her about it, so I can say a little bit. Essentially, about 12 years ago, there was a particular molecule that most big pharma companies were pursuing. Because of antitrust, they couldn't talk to each other about what they were doing. But privately, they each sort of knew that the other was going after this. It looked like it would be promising for Alzheimer's and some other potential applications. And so figuring out the biomarkers, the way in which when this molecule changes from a healthy to a disease state or from a disease back to a healthy state, the markers for that would have enormous value for drug development and health. Unfortunately, literally billions of dollars were being spent, billions with a B, by the industry, all of whom eventually at the same time realized that it was a dead end, that if you tamper with this molecule, people would die, essentially. And so it was on the heels of that collective failure that they formed this consortium. The consortium includes the National Institutes of Health. Importantly, it also includes the FDA. The industry wanted the regulators in the room so they could see what was coming with new science, and the FDA wanted to be in the room. Of course, you wanted pharma, but you also wanted biotech and academia and patient advocacy organizations. So it was a multi-stakeholder consortia that formed to identify and ultimately qualify biomarkers. Now, institutionally, the industry has both regulation and competition. And essentially what they did is they carved out in between the regulation and competition, what they called was a pre-competitive space. A space where a series of different steering committees would work, and there's literally been over 20 projects in the last 10 years identifying biomarkers, openly sharing the data, and Barbara, as the founding architect, would, on a regular basis, people would say, well, we can't share that data, that's commercially valuable. And she'd say, remember, we're pre-competitive. But they also had to learn that what was pre-competitive for some pharmaceutical companies was actually competitive for some instrument designers and test equipment designers in the biotechnology field. So projects that might be pre-competitive for some were competitive for others. So they had to say, we opt out of that project because we want to retain our competitive posture. And for others, they had lawyers that essentially said, if you take notes and don't discuss pricing, you're not going to violate antitrust. And to this day, the group functions within the Foundation for NIH and really represents an institutional shift in the industry to the point where many of the big pharmaceutical companies now have internal committees on all of the different consortia that they're members of. And the very boundaries of the firms are now blurring because the industry increasingly says, on a number of topics, how do we form these multi-stakeholder consortia to do what we can't do through the competitive and regulatory approaches? So this is part of this panel in the sense that the data is embedded in institutional arrangements that have to navigate outside of the bounds of markets and regulation. And with that, I turn to Alysia to take us through our final case example. The floor is yours, Alysia.
Thank you very much. So today I'll touch on interesting dynamics around participation around data work, specifically participation of stakeholders that are outside of classical roles in production, specifically in the production of goods and then in the production of materials. So first, taking the production of goods, there's very interesting dynamics that have been born from COVID that have accelerated our understanding of the capacity and the need for local and regional production and participation of actors in that. So here on the left, you see the Fab Lab, a snapshot of the Global Fab Lab Network. Fab Labs are a local and regional workshops for making things that have a core set of capacity which relates to digital manufacturing. And that's been growing exponentially for the last decade or so. And as you see, there's labs pretty much everywhere in the world now that actually make goods and services and have the critical capacity to serve their local communities. And that was made very apparent when COVID hit, where there was supply chain bottlenecks and disruptions and collapse, specifically around the area of PPE. On the right, you see the different contributions that basically Fab Labs around the world started making. And interestingly, the digital designs were usually open source and were shared and were actually iterated by diverse communities. And you see that a lot of makers, designers, people that weren't actually in the business of producing PPE suddenly got involved and really helped those, created stopgaps for critical supply shortages on a local level. Next slide, please. And that leads to a kind of general paradigm shift, which I think is happening and is under the radar often, but is the growing need to decentralize manufacturing and decentralize the means of production. That's happening through the digitization of manufacturing. And in general, it's a shift from a more centralized way of producing goods to a more decentralized way that's actually in keeping with local and regional economies in terms of their participation and the feedback and knowledge that is inherent in those networks. Now, my work specifically looks at materials in that paradigm because, interestingly enough, although the Global Fab Lab Network is kind of leading the way in terms of understanding how production could become more localized in the future, the materials that are supplying those labs and digital fabrication in general is usually quite centralized still. So we're still pulling up oil, petroleum from the ground and exporting it through global supply chains. And that actually was a bottleneck that, even though people were producing PPE, for instance, locally, plastics were difficult to come by in some locations because of those global supply chains difficulties and the lack of resilience and adaptability in them. So my work is focusing on looking at regional and local approaches to those supply chains, specifically looking at sourcing local materials, local biomass for production at a local and regional level. Next slide, please. And in how to accelerate that, we're developing what is really data work in the materials space, specifically by developing a platform where anyone anywhere can develop materials and share data. And in order to do that, we're developing the protocols necessary to make sure that data is very transparent. So, right now, in order to make a material and certify it, you need to use a very industry standard lab or a university lab where there's protocols, et cetera. And so in order to open up potential access to people contributing data in many diverse locations, such as developing materials in Fab Labs, we need to develop really transparent protocols for how that material was made, measured, et cetera, under what circumstances. And that really is about opening up who participates, because right now, at least from a materials standpoint, who makes materials and the data around them is a very closed, kind of closely held set of disciplines and people involved. And in order to open up the potential for a decentralized world of material development and supply, we need to open up knowledge on that in a radical way. So that's the work through the Materium platform that we're leading.
Super. And needless to say, you are the architect of that platform, and we appreciate paying attention to, in a sense, the material flow in the supply chain. And with that, we turn to John, our discussant. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm not going to recapitulate everything that's been said. It's obviously taken a long time, and there's a lot of good points in there that I'm not going to dwell on, but I'm going to kind of focus on three things that I heard. One is data work has been around for a long time. It's changing. Increasingly, it's being recognized as central to what we do. It's been recognized as central in a lot of things for a long time. But the proliferation of data science and data programs and so forth is clearly an indicator that it's being taken more seriously. And one of the things that's happening, and this is kind of pointed to by Nick's work, is that there is an increasing focus on the school nature of organizations that produce people who learn how to do this kind of stuff, and they leave and they go out into the world. And that diaspora is kind of the purpose that schools were created for. So on the one hand, you've got a growing school-based production system, and you've also got a system where people create new skills and so forth at their jobs, and then they move on. And it's becoming more common for people to move to numerous organizations rather than spending their entire career in one organization. So that's one area that I think is kind of important in the work we're doing. The second one is the growth of this kind of work, this data-focused work through consortia. As the data that Joel used at the beginning showed, there's a very substantial growth in the number of consortia. My guess is, and this is just conjecture, there is something attractive to organizations about this structure of a consortium. For one thing, it provides enough control over intellectual property and other kinds of things that organizations feel comfortable entering into it, but it facilitates and doesn't slow down sharing. And I think that's a really crucial piece of, it's an adjustment that organizations are making to the increased importance of data work, which is in a growing way, it's across organizational boundaries. So that's becoming kind of important too. One of the things I want to touch on and kind of allude to it, but we haven't got time to really go into it. I mean, some people can ask some questions about it, is the fact that anytime you've got something that's been important for a long time and it's been produced under a particular regime of production for a long time, and you switch it to a growing focus of work and a new kind of structure to do it, it's going to be political. And data work is very political. And I want to kind of touch on three things that's political about data work. One is this focus on openness. If you look at the focus on openness in the data world, a lot of it's stimulated by open source software. You'll see that there's a lot of ties to concepts like GitHub and so forth, and which are open source software elements of production. But there is very often a strongly anti-proprietary bias in the concept of openness. Openness is only good if it doesn't involve ownership. Getting rid of ownership is a principle of openness, and I don't think that's correct. If you look at the great groundswell of sharing that happened in the field of chemistry, for example, that surrounded the introduction of chemical abstracts, which was a commercially published book, you see that really accelerated the business. And that's all I'm going to say about that one. We heard Matt introduce the issue of gender politics, which is a very big deal. A lot of what we call a capability in data has been produced in the form of what he refers to as curation. And it's a highly feminized line of work. So people were called computers. There were women who were called computers. There were women who were called librarians, women who were called data curators, women who were called file clerks. They did this kind of work, and as a routine thing, that's where classification and cataloging came from. And now it's increasingly in the realm of men. And I still think that a lot of the capability to do this kind of work comes from the feminized fields, but the, shall we say, the money is going to the men. So that's kind of interesting. And I'll just close with one final observation, which is about disability politics. We heard a little bit about the protein data bank and the focus on protein folding. One of the biggest application areas of citizen science is a website called Foldit, which is a protein folding website. It turns out that many of the best protein folders are people who have Asperger's syndrome. So we have an open question. Are we giving Asperger's people new opportunities, or are we exploiting them? And that's a political question that hasn't been answered yet. So back to you, Joel.
Well, I really want to appreciate everyone on this panel. Needless to say, you're hearing from folks who are architects and founders and originators at ways of thinking about data and data work, and the consortia, the institutions that surround it. Interestingly, we've surfaced some, as John says, political dimensions that the story is socially constructed, and it is not necessarily a neutral story. There are power and dynamics and resources that are in play. So with that in mind, let me open it up. We have a number of folks here in the audience, and we'd love to hear your comments and questions. As a group, we're used to talking to each other about all of this, so don't be surprised if we play off each other as well. But I'm wondering whether any of you have comments or questions. I know, Chris, you began your career in a lab, and so we're sort of reminding you of your roots. Go ahead, Helen.
I'd like to make a comment about the anti-proprietary aspect. Yes, that's somewhat true, but the fact is one of the rules of the PDB is that everything is open and you can do whatever you want with the data. And if what you do with the data is better than what has been done in the open way, and you can make money on it, so be it. Okay, so that has been an attitude that the stewards of the data have taken, and I think the only thing I'd like to say that where it broke a little bit, that idea, is when DeepMind succeeded in making a huge advance in protein structure prediction, which they did because it's Google and they have more computers than anybody could ever imagine, and they put all their resources to it. I think that was a good thing that what they did, but I think some people felt that they couldn't have done the AI without all the data there. It couldn't have been done. It would have been nice if they gave a little gift to the people who spent all those years. I'm talking about some kind of a gift to the PDB to let us continue doing what it is we do, but that's never going to happen. Okay, but it should happen. The same thing, the same attitude. All the drug companies use the PDB data to produce drugs and to make gargantuan amounts of money, okay? And they can't do it without the PDB. But if you ask the pharma companies for a donation, say for a meeting or in any way to help the PDB move forward, they will not do it. And their response to it is, we're taxpayers too, okay? And so, that has been a problem. So the people who do this kind of data work just have to keep the high road because they believe in it and we believe in it so much. But it would be nice if there was some kind of a payback or some kind of acknowledgement that all, and I have to say that the PDB is funded by public funds, there's no question about it. And so that we are taxpayers too has some merit to it, but I think that is an issue. But it doesn't stop the PDB and other organizations like the PDB from doing the data work.
So I really want to just highlight some dimensions of what you said. The first is that we are talking about common pool resources, and you get these tragedies of the commons where everybody benefits, but then who pays? And what we have are government agencies that will often do 3-year or 5-year grants, but not sustaining funding for data repositories of various kinds. So there are tragedy of the commons kinds of issues at play here. That's one thing. And of course, Elinor Ostrom talked about governing the commons. How do you actually build up that capacity? And I think what's at stake in this conversation is that these data facilities are increasingly central to societal challenges of all kinds. And but society yet doesn't know, in a sense, how to maintain them as infrastructure. Or in the case of what Alysia is talking about, the recipes for materials are some of the closest guarded secrets of commercial companies. And so what she's doing by making these recipes open is actually, quite challenging to business models and democratizing, in a sense, the data. So there's a whole set of issues that are at play here that are, in a sense, institutions are being formed, rules of the game are being generated on things that we all depend on, but that we're not seeing. This is mostly hidden and not visible. But let me pause here. Bill, why don't you state the question that you put in the chat?
I had to unmute. So, which is just the opposite of what most people would like me to do most of the time. The thought occurred to me listening to these wonderful, brief, but very dense presentations that we're at a LERA conference, and these fields of data curation are really of interest to me, and I haven't thought about it before, as they relate to the constituencies that comprise the Labor and Employment Relations Association. And I'm not sure what the implications are for the expansion and arising of databases and curation in communities of access to information in ways that could be beneficial to and democratize the understanding and the activities of different components of the employment and labor relations communities in the United States and globally. I think there are implications, and there may be some things that have been done already that I haven't thought through. I've been what struck me is sitting here is I've been a contributing editor at the Library of Congress for 41 years in the Hispanic division. And it never occurred to me, and this is my stupidity, that almost everybody I work with is a woman curating all the information that is produced about every field in Latin American studies. It's dismaying to me, but not surprising that I'm so thick-headed.
So first of all, I think we're all, we did a dry run yesterday, and it was like, I know this, but I didn't know it, that there's all of this stuff around data analytics programs that universities are offering. My own son does data analysis coming out of sports, which, by the way, is more male oriented. And that's getting all this attention. And yet here's this equally large body of work, which, by the way, is often some of the very same work, which, as Matt points out, the word curation comes from a caring as compared to an extracting kind of mindset. So I think there's layers and layers to this that we've hardly fully tapped. I see Alysia has her hand up, but I'll just make one more quick point, because you said, what does this matter for LERA? I would say, one, it's a form of work that is pervasive and not appreciated. We did a workshop in which we invited HR professionals from universities to come work with some of these data facilities, and they had no job ladders, no career paths, no job titles even to go with the work. So it didn't fit into known categories. And so for the people in employment relations, there's a challenge. How will you deal with this new kind of work? It's not new, but it doesn't fit into categories. The second thing is that, interestingly, people in this domain are forming consortia rather than hierarchical organizations. They're laterally working together, they're collaborating. So there's a set of norms happening here which are different, and I think will become definitive in the 21st century as an organizational or institutional form, working laterally across organizational boundaries in collaborative modes. But the last thing is there are competitive domains here. There are power politics that show up around the data, and there are resource issues and others, so that it's a rich domain worthy of study. But go ahead, Alysia.
I just wanted to add something really brief, which is that I think a lot of this data sharing that we've touched on actually has implications for work beyond the actual work of curating and the data work itself. So what the space I'm in is really looking at trying to incentivize and create more local economic development opportunities for materials production and product production, which are currently locked out of the general the dominant economic system. And so the openness of data itself also has implications for other parts of the economy from a work and work relations perspective.
Yeah, and people should know that Alysia is coming in from Santiago, Chile, and she's doing amazing work with with people on the coast, small fishing villages that could harvest seaweed as a material for production in ways that will be transformative. And you're right, it's outside of the economic system. We're supposed to stop at 3:45, so we're actually slightly over. The group won't be coming into this room for a little bit yet. So I just want to see, before we wrap it up, whether anybody else who's here wants to share observations or comments. We'd be delighted to hear your thoughts. And of course, any of the panelists are welcome to do so as well. Bonnie and Chris, can I call on you to share a thought or two?
Thanks, Joel. I found this extremely interesting, and as you might guess, with my nursing background from 100 years ago, why the business about the pharmaceuticals and what's going on, but also as a school board member, we're always looking for areas for our children who come through our special education programs. And I was particularly interested in the fact that young people, or older people, I guess too, with Asperger's are particularly good at certain aspects of this. And I was thinking that it would be worth exploring that a bit more. Obviously at this late hour, it's not the time to do it, but it brings up some interesting questions for school board members and for employers and unions and all, in terms of both the aspect of, is it exploiting these young people, or is this really a viable option for them so that they don't end up on welfare or in institutions or something for the rest of their lives? So there's a real rich discussion, I think, to be had there.
Go ahead, Helen.
So as the mother and grandmother of two boys, both of whom have Asperger's, but now is called high functioning autism. Okay. One of whom has a PhD in physics and is well employed. And because I have managed so many people who are skilled in computational areas, I actually think that what used to be called Asperger's or high functioning autism is a feature and not a bug. And that in fact, we are missing the boat in the education of these people. My son Oling was saved by a very talented math teacher who saw right away that he was just fine. They just needed to channel what he was doing.
Mhm.
So I think this is something I would like to continue thinking about going forward, because as I said, in the work that I've done over the years, I've seen many high functioning autistic people be very, very successful, but you have to know how to work with the people who have real strengths in certain areas and of course weaknesses in others. So that's something I think we need to explore some more.
It's interesting. Years ago, I facilitated a workshop of all of the state librarians across the state of Illinois on Asperger's. And so we had about 200 librarians in the room, and we had professionals from the various societies. By the way, they couldn't agree to have a single website. There were like 4 different websites in the state of Illinois, and everyone said, no, we're the website. But what was interesting is halfway through the conference, the librarian said, I guess we're on the spectrum too, many of us. And so there was a whole conversation about, in a sense, folks who do classification, who do data work, that's a unique skill and ability. And we do a disservice by giving it a label in a box rather than understanding it for what it is. A talent, a capability, and so as we look at the data work, there are all these dimensions that are just not in the discussion, but that in fact are a delight to lift up. Go ahead, Bill.
Joel, the example that was given about the sort of self-mobilized data collection, development of algorithms to analyze the working condition of Uber drivers suggests to me that there might be opportunities for us to learn about and study comparable grassroots mobilization for self-analyzing, and then provide that information, providing a foundation, a resource for empowerment of different working populations within the developing economy that is increasingly providing opportunities for gig work, for example, and communities of people. Here in Nashville, I think there's something that has been studied a little bit by Dan Cornfield in his book on the music community of Nashville, which was reviewed in Perspectives on Work a couple of years ago by me, of course. But I think that if we began to look, we would see that you can't keep people down. They're going to start taking control of their environment and organizing it, and analyze it, and using it to improve their condition, just as these Uber drivers were doing. And so that's something that maybe we should be looking at.
Well, in fact, when we had that meeting with the HR professionals and the data workers, I invited Dan Cornfield to come to that conference because they were saying we're forming a profession. And for those of you that don't know, Dan is the editor of the sociological journal Work and Occupations. So he went through what is an occupation, and he says, well, you control entry, you set standards. He went through this whole list of how occupations are formed. What was fascinating is the group said, but we don't want to control entry. We want to encourage entry. This is an exciting field. We don't want to restrict it. We want to build it up. And so their norms were collaborative and open and inclusive rather than closed and restrictive. And so there was a whole set of values that were at play for this as an occupation that just runs counter to a lot of assumptions. But literally, at 1:30, I went to a LIRA panel on food collaboration. And it was a group of folks in universities who are trying to form a consortium to organize the purchasing of sustainable food and organic foods for universities, which account for massive food purchasing. And so the California system was at the meeting, and 3 or 4 other university systems. And they were saying, we need to create a consortium. Guess what? To basically accomplish together what we can't do separately around food education, food purchasing, and food security through universities. So I think you're right, Bill, that what's underneath this isn't just the data work, but also the institutional form of a consortium. And it's an empowering forum for people to connect together in new ways. Go ahead, Alysia.
Quick comment on what data work could be, and I think that's could be shifting quite a lot. We work with very different communities that have equally valid sources of data in materials. So we look at material scientists who have a certain way of representing and curating and consuming data, as well as artists and designers who also work with materials. And what we're trying to do is create an infrastructure that will ingest data from those different communities. And so I think it's really important in this space to really think flexibly about not only what data is and the kind of validity of communities or disciplines that, you know, may have really good data, we just can't talk to each other yet, and trying to create kind of collective infrastructure that can make the job easier so that data can basically be aggregated and collected from very diverse communities who think of what counts as data very differently.
I think that's fascinating, that not all data is the same and not all data work, as Matt emphasized, is the same. And so, you know, in a sense, this is like the early biological work of just, can we classify the flora and the fauna? Cool. Well, I think we are over time. I really want to give a big round of applause to everyone on the panel for their work, and really want to lift up how this has, you know, sort of opened up a conversation that I think will be of greater importance in the years to come. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joel.
Thank you.
Joel.
And thank you,
Thanks to-
Bernadette.
Yeah, thanks to the panel and Joel, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Good
Bye.
time.
Bye.
I was gonna